Rachel was only 5 years old when her world turned upside down. Her loving and kind parents, who always smiled whenever she entered the room, lost their lives in a terrible accident one rainy evening while returning from the village market. Her aunt, Madame Stella, who already had two daughters, Amanda and Cynthia, took her in, not out of love, but because there was no one else. And so for the past 14 years, Rachel was treated like a slave, while her daughters were pampered like princesses. Every morning, even before the sun rose, she was made to sweep the compound, fetch water, fetch firewood, wash clothes, cook food she wasn't even allowed to eat, and clean until her fingers ached. And when she made a small mistake, even if it wasn't her fault, Madame Stella would beat her with a stick or pour pepper in her eyes. Her cousins would laugh and call her names like witch or cursed child. Yet, Rachel endured it all. Even though everyone in the village felt sorry for her, none was bold enough to confront Madame Stella. In that same village, near the hills and far away from people, lived Elijah, a quiet and humble farmer. He was known by few, respected by fewer, and loved by none, except the old woman who bought yams from his farm. Elijah always wore old clothes and carried a raffia basket. His hands were rough, his nails filled with dirt, and his hut was made of mud and palm fronds. But what no one knew was that Elijah was not who he seemed. 2 years ago, when his father the king had told him about the tradition of the land, where he would have to pick a wife among the maidens once he returned from abroad, he told his father of his plan to disguise himself so he can find a maiden of good character. So upon his arrival, he didn't go to the palace. Instead, he went straight to the small hut which had been prepared for him by his father, without anyone knowing. For 2 years, Elijah lived like the rest of the villagers, waking up before dawn, tilling the earth, selling at the market, and watching the maidens. The few maidens he approached mocked him for being poor. But Rachel was different. Whenever he saw her walking along the village path, his heart skipped. She never wore makeup or fancy clothes, yet she was the most beautiful soul he had ever seen. She greeted him with respect, and over time they became friends. They spoke kindly to one another and exchanged smiles. But Elijah never imagined that one day she would be forced into his arms, not as a friend, but as a wife. The village buzzed with excitement as the royal family sent word through the town criers that their only son, Prince Lucas, was returning from abroad, and upon his arrival, he would choose a bride from among the maidens. Every maiden in the land was therefore expected to prepare for his coming in 7 days' time. Amanda and Cynthia, upon hearing the announcement, began jumping around shouting, "Mama, I will be the next queen." That evening, Madame Stella brought out her old sewing machine and began sewing new dresses for her daughters. She rubbed their faces with raw honey and smeared shea butter on their legs to make them shine. But deep in her heart, she knew none of her daughters could match Rachel's beauty, not even close. Fear began to grow inside her like weeds. She kept staring at Rachel, who was now 21, tall, slim, and beautiful, like a river goddess. That night, she called her daughters into her room and locked the door. They whispered for hours, while Rachel lay outside on her mat, unaware that her fate was about to be changed forever. Madame Stella couldn't risk letting the prince see Rachel. If the prince saw her, he would surely choose her. And if that happened, her own daughters would become servants forever. That night, she made a wicked plan to get Rachel married off before the prince returned, and not just to anyone, but to the poor farmer whose name no one respected. Madame Stella arrived at Elijah's hut just as the cock crowed. Her two daughters stood behind her, their arms folded, sneering at the small house made of red mud. Elijah had just returned from the farm with firewood on his head. He was surprised to see them. He dropped the load and greeted them politely. But Madame Stella didn't waste time with greetings. She looked around the place and wrinkled her nose as if the air was foul. Then she smiled and said, "Elijah, I have a gift for you. A wife." Elijah was shocked. He blinked and asked, "A wife?" Madame Stella nodded quickly. "Yes, Rachel, my niece. You see, she's of age now, and I feel it's time for her to settle down. You are hardworking, but you need help. She's hardworking too, and she will serve you well." Elijah's heart skipped. Rachel? Marry him? He had dreamt of it, yes, but not like this. Not without her consent, and not arranged by her wicked aunt like a basket of cassava. He wanted to ask if Rachel agreed to it, but Madame Stella continued before he could speak. "You don't need to pay any bride price," she said. "Just come with your kinsman and make it official. We'll do a small wedding, nothing big." Elijah could feel something was wrong. The offer was too good to be true, but he had also heard the announcement that the prince was returning very soon, and that all maidens were preparing for his arrival. Then it made sense. Madame Stella wanted to hide Rachel away before the royal invitation reached her ears. Elijah didn't say yes immediately. He looked down at his feet, confused. But he loved Rachel, and he knew that if he rejected the offer, her wicked aunt would find someone else. No, he wouldn't let that happen. So he agreed. That night, Rachel was in the backyard washing plates under the moonlight when Madame Stella called her inside. "Come and sit," she ordered, pointing to the low stool beside her. Rachel obeyed, wiping her wet hands on her wrapper. Amanda and Cynthia were sitting by the corner, smirking like two rats that had stolen yam. Madame Stella cleared her throat and began, "Rachel, tomorrow you'll be getting married." Rachel froze. "Married?" she whispered, her voice trembling. She thought she had heard wrong. Madame Stella nodded. "Yes, to Elijah the farmer. You know him. He's a good man, and we have already arranged everything. So tomorrow morning, you will pack your things and go with him." Rachel's heart dropped like a stone. Her hands began to shake. "But Auntie, I don't want to marry him," she said, tears filling her eyes. "I don't even know him well enough to be his wife." Madame Stella's eyes turned sharp. She stood up and slapped Rachel so hard her head spun. "Who asked you to speak? Did I ask for your opinion? Foolish girl. You should be grateful I took you in after the death of your miserable parents. Oh, so your plan is to block my daughter's glory, right? Well, you have failed. Let me tell you something. By this time tomorrow, you're already in your husband's house. Do you understand?" Amanda and Cynthia laughed loudly as Madame Stella grabbed Rachel's ear. "I said, do you understand?" Rachel held her face and cried, "Yes, Auntie." That night, Rachel cried till her eyes were swollen. She looked at the stars through the window and thought of her dead parents. Then she thought of Elijah. Though he was a nice man, but she wasn't just ready to be called a wife. But what choice did she have? By morning, she would be married. The morning sun rose quietly, but Rachel's heart beat with fear. Birds chirped, goats bleated, and the village carried on like nothing unusual was happening. But inside Madame Stella's compound, everything was different. Rachel sat on a small wooden stool, dressed in a faded wrapper and old blouse. No beads, no flowers, no joy. Madame Stella refused to spend even 1 naira on Rachel. Why waste money on a girl who is going to a poor man's house? She scoffed. Amanda and Cynthia watched from the window, whispering and laughing. Elijah came with 2 elders and a small calabash of palm wine. He wore his usual brown trousers and a simple shirt. His eyes kept scanning Rachel's face, but she didn't look up. She sat still like a carved statue. Her hands on her laps, her face wet with quiet tears. Elijah wanted to speak to her, to ask if this was truly what she wanted, but the elders began the rites quickly. No music, no dance, just a quiet exchange of words and blessings under the mango tree. She handed Rachel a small nylon bag containing her clothes. That's your property. Go and be useful to someone else. Rachel stood slowly, still in shock. She glanced at her aunt one last time, hoping to see a trace of mercy. But Madame Stella's face was like stone. Elijah stepped forward and offered his hand, but Rachel didn't take it. She followed him silently, walking towards a new life she didn't choose, and a man she barely knew. Elijah led Rachel through a narrow bush. Elijah led Rachel through a narrow bush path leading to the outskirts of the village. The trees whispered in the wind, and birds flew across the sky. But Rachel didn't hear any of it. Her mind was numb. She didn't even know where she was going. After minutes of walking in silence, they reached a small hill, and there stood Elijah's humble home, a small mud hut with a thatched roof, surrounded by overgrown grass and scattered firewood. "We are home," Elijah said gently, opening the wooden door. Rachel stood still, staring at the hut. The roof had holes. The floor was bare. There was only one mat inside, a small cooking pot in the corner, and a wooden bench. Rachel stepped in slowly, her eyes scanning the place. It smelled of dry earth. She placed her small bag on the floor and sat on the bench, not saying a word. Elijah watched her quietly. He could see the sadness in her eyes and the pain behind her silence. He sat a few steps away from her and spoke softly. "Rachel, I know this is not what you wanted, and I know this is not how a woman should be given away. I didn't plan for it to be like this either. But please, you will not be a slave in my house. I promise you that. I will try my best to make you happy." Rachel looked at him and nodded, holding back tears. She wasn't angry at Elijah. She knew he wasn't a wicked man. But the feeling of being thrown away like a useless cloth hurt deeply. That night, she curled up on the mat, her back to Elijah, and cried quietly into her wrapper. Elijah lay on the bench, looking at the ceiling, praying in his heart that one day she would forgive him. The next morning, Rachel woke up early, out of habit, and began sweeping the compound. She didn't even notice Elijah standing by the doorway. "Rachel, what are you doing?" he asked. "I'm just trying to clean up the compound," she said. "No, you shouldn't be doing that. I told you before that you are not going to be a slave in my house, so allow me to treat you like the queen that you are." Rachel handed the broom to him and stepped aside, with a shocked but relieved expression as she watched him clean the compound. Moments later, Elijah arrived with a delicious bowl of porridge. "Bon appetit," he said. Rachel looked at him confused. "You cooked for me?" she asked. Elijah chuckled. "Is it wrong for a man to cook for his wife?" "No, it's just that I've never felt this way since my parents died." "Thank you, Elijah," she said. Elijah looked at her and smiled. The next few days were the most peaceful days she had ever had in her life. He never raised his voice. He never touched her, never allowed her to do any work. All she did was just sit and watch him do everything. But soon she became bored. So one afternoon, she decided to go fetch firewood and cook for him before he returned from the market. On her way, she slipped and sprained her ankle. She hissed in pain and sat on the ground. Suddenly, Elijah appeared from behind a tree. "I was following you from afar," he said. "I thought I asked you not to do anything." And without waiting for permission, he carried her on his shoulder and took her home. Rachel looked at him, surprised. His hands were rough, but his touch was careful. "Why are you being so nice to me?" she asked softly. Elijah didn't answer at first. Then he smiled and said, "Because you're my queen, Rachel. Besides, I see the pain in your eyes." Rachel's lips parted slightly, but no words came. No one had ever spoken to her like that, not even her parents, before they died. That night, when they sat under the moonlight eating roasted corn, Rachel looked at Elijah differently. Though he was still poor, his clothes were still torn, but she saw a good man. And though she didn't realize it yet, she was falling in love with him. The news of Rachel's sudden marriage to Elijah spread like wildfire. At the market square, women whispered over baskets of tomatoes. "Did you hear?" one woman said, slicing okra. "That fine girl, Rachel. She's now the wife of that poor farmer that lives near the hill." Another woman shook her head and added, "Ah, what a waste of beauty. She could have married a prince if not for that wicked aunt of hers." Though Madame Stella pretended not to care, inside her heart, she boiled with anger. Meanwhile, the village square was already getting ready for the grand occasion. The king's messengers had begun putting up red and gold banners. The village crier went from house to house, announcing that Prince Lucas would arrive in 3 days. All maidens were to gather at the palace for the prince to choose his bride. Girls danced with joy. Mothers polished their daughters like ripe mangoes. But one girl was missing from the excitement: Rachel. She sat on a wooden stool outside her new home, peeling cassava and humming softly. She hadn't heard the news. Elijah had heard, of course, but he said nothing. He watched her from inside the hut, wondering if her heart had begun to heal and if she would ever see him for who he truly was. That night, Elijah couldn't sleep. He looked at Rachel, sleeping quietly on the mat, her chest rising and falling with peace he hadn't seen before. He couldn't tell her the truth, not yet. If she knew he was a prince, would she think he tricked her? Would she believe that he truly wanted her? not out of pity, but out of love. He had only 2 days left before the ceremony. He had to return to the palace, but before he left, he needed to find a way to tell her the truth. That morning, Elijah went to the farm and worked harder than ever before. He harvested yams, gathered palm fruits, and returned with a calabash of sweet palm wine. He prepared a special meal, boiled yam with palm oil, spiced snail and palm wine. Rachel came out of the hut surprised. "What's the occasion?" she asked softly. Elijah smiled and said, "I just wanted to thank you for being my wife." Rachel sat beside him and ate slowly. For the first time, she laughed. Just a small laugh, but it made Elijah's heart leap. He looked at her passionately and whispered into her eyes, "I love you." "I love you too," she said, shyly. "Really?" he asked. "I'm serious. Your kindness has made me forget my pain, and I don't ever want to leave your side." "Thank you for choosing me as your wife," she said. He thought of telling her the truth at this point, but then he didn't. He just smiled. The sun had not yet reached the middle of the sky when a royal messenger arrived at Elijah's compound. He wore a red cap with golden beads and held a scroll sealed with the king's emblem. Rachel was sweeping the compound when she saw him. Her heart skipped. Visitors never came to their home, especially not men dressed like that. "Is this the house of Elijah the farmer?" the messenger asked. Elijah stepped forward calmly and nodded. "Yes, I am Elijah." The man bowed respectfully and handed him the scroll. "You are summoned by the king. The prince must return at once. The coronation and bride selection will begin in 3 days." With that, the man turned and left without another word. Rachel looked at Elijah confused. "Why are you being summoned at the palace?" she asked. Elijah paused. His eyes met hers, and he realized the moment had come. "Rachel," he said, holding her hand. "Tomorrow, the prince is returning from abroad, and there's something I have to do at the palace. Promise me that you will be at the palace with other maidens tomorrow." She didn't understand what was happening, but he sounded serious. "I promise," she said quietly. Elijah smiled, but his eyes were heavy. "I will miss you," he said, touching her cheek. Rachel watched him walk into the hut and pack a small leather bag. Her chest felt tight, like something important was about to slip away. The palace gates opened wide as Elijah arrived in a royal car, no longer wearing his torn trousers or dusty slippers. Now, he was dressed in rich blue velvet, adorned with coral beads and golden embroidery. His once rough hair was now neatly cut, and his face glowed. The guards blew the trumpets as he walked past. The king stood at the palace entrance with open arms and teary eyes. "My son," he said proudly, "you have returned. Your mother and I have waited so long for this day." Elijah knelt and touched the ground in respect. "Father, I am so happy to see you." The queen embraced him, whispering, "You have grown into a man of honor." That day, the palace erupted in celebration. Drummers beat their talking drums, maidens danced with colorful wrappers. But Prince Lucas, or Elijah as you know him, was not interested in any of them. His mind was far away, thinking of his pretty wife, Rachel. In the king's chambers, The elders gathered to discuss the bride selection. The king reminded everyone of the tradition. The prince must choose his bride before coronation. The maidens must present themselves tomorrow. The queen said, "Let the prince see them and choose wisely." Elijah nodded respectfully, but inside he was troubled. He had already seen the woman he wanted, and her name was Rachel. But how was he going to tell his parents? And would Rachel believe he was truly the man she had lived with, laughed with, and trusted? By evening, every corner of the village was already talking. "Did you hear? The prince has returned. He's so handsome." Eh? The news reached Madame Stella's compound quickly. Amanda rushed in with excitement. "Mama, Mama, they said the prince is finally back, and he's even more handsome than we imagined." Madame Stella jumped from her stool and clapped her hands. "Finally, girls, get your things ready. Tomorrow we are going to the palace." Amanda and Cynthia giggled and ran to prepare their outfits. Madame Stella didn't waste time. She had only one goal in mind: to make sure one of her daughters became the queen. The long-awaited bride selection day finally arrived. Maidens from every corner of the village gathered at the palace gates, dressed in their finest wrappers and jewelry. Some wore gilly, tied high like towers. Others had new beads hanging from their necks. But the prince didn't notice anything. His eyes kept scanning the place for Rachel, but there was no sign of her. "Where are you, Rachel? Did you forget your promise? God, please make her come." He prayed silently as he sat beside the king and queen, watching as each maiden stepped forward, bowed, then danced, hoping to win his attention. Amanda twirled proudly, showing off her waist beads. Cynthia winked with powdered face, smiling as if she had already won. Madame Stella stood with the crowd, nodding in approval. "One of my daughters must be queen today," she whispered to herself. But as each girl passed, Prince Lucas only bowed politely. None of them moved him. None of them had Rachel's grace. Then the queen stood and raised her hand. "There is one more maiden to be brought before the prince," she announced. Everyone turned, expecting a beauty queen to walk in. But instead, a royal guard came forward with an empty scroll. "Your Highness," he said, "this last name was chosen by the prince himself. She is not in this gathering." A silence fell. The prince rose to his feet and spoke for the first time. "The woman I have chosen is not here," he said calmly. "She is not wearing gold or makeup. She's not in this palace. She's in a small hut near the hill, and her name is Rachel." The palace courtyard turned upside down. Women clutched their wrappers. Young girls wailed in shock, and some fainted from disbelief. Madame Stella stood like a tree struck by lightning. Her lips trembled. "Rachel? That useless orphan?" Amanda screamed. "It's a lie. It must be a mistake." Cynthia started crying. But the prince had spoken, and no one dared question a royal decree. He raised his hand to silence the crowd. "You see, when my father the king told me of his intention of choosing a bride from among the maidens, I came up with a plan to disguise myself so as to know which maiden deserves to be my wife. I lived among you as Elijah the poor farmer. I watched how you people treated me because I was poor. And in that quiet life, I found the woman whose heart shines brighter than gold. Madame Stella's knees buckled, and she sat on the floor, staring into space. She remembered all the times she beat Rachel, the pepper punishments, the hunger, the insults, and now that same girl would become the queen of the land. The shame washed over her like hot oil. Meanwhile, Rachel sat by her hut, peeling cassava quietly when she heard loud footsteps. Then she remembered her promise to Elijah. The palace guards arrived. "Good day," they greeted. "By the order of His Royal Highness Prince Lucas, you are summoned to the palace. He has chosen you as his bride." Rachel dropped the knife. "But I'm married," she whispered in shock. "You will understand when you get to the palace," the guard said. Rachel sat quietly in the royal car. Her heart beat fast as she stared out the window, watching the path she had walked 100 times as it looked different. Villagers stood along the road, bowing and pointing. Some whispered in disbelief. Others waved, but she didn't understand. She wasn't dressed like a queen. She wore the same faded orange dress from that morning. Her feet were dusty. Her hair was tied in a rough bun. She had no makeup, no perfume, no jewelry. And yet, here she was in a car meant for royalty. As they approached the palace gates, her breath ceased as the large doors opened slowly, revealing the grand courtyard filled with nobles, maidens, guards, and drummers. At the center, standing tall in the royal attire, was Elijah. No, Prince Lucas. His face lit up when he saw her. He walked forward, his arms open wide, and said, "Welcome, Rachel. You have always been a queen. Now, the world will see it too." Rachel stopped at the steps. "You are a prince?" she asked in disbelief. "All this time, you were a prince?" He nodded gently. "I'm sorry, Rachel. I didn't hide who I was to trick you. I just wanted to find the right woman, and I did. You loved me without complaining. You loved me without knowing who I truly was. And that is why I chose you." Tears rolled down her cheeks as the crowd watched in silence. Before Rachel could be presented to the king and queen formally, royal tradition required her to undergo the cleansing ceremony, an ancient rite where every chosen bride was bathed in sacred oils, dressed in coral beads, and adorned like a queen. Palace maidens led her to the queen's chamber, where a large clay bath awaited, surrounded by flowers, perfumed water, and gentle music from flute players outside. Rachel stood nervously, her eyes wide. Everything felt like a dream. "Please," she whispered, "I'm not used to this." One of the older palace attendants smiled warmly and held her hand. "Don't be afraid, my daughter. You are about to become the most honored woman in the land. You deserve this and more." They removed her old clothes, gently bathed her in warm water mixed with petals, milk, and honey. They scrubbed her skin with soft sponges, cleaned her hair, and rubbed her body with sacred oils. The scent filled the room. Her skin glowed like the morning sun. For the first time in her life, Rachel was treated like royalty, not with pity, not with mockery, but with honor and care. After the bath, they wrapped her in a white cloth, placed golden anklets on her feet, and lined her hair with coral beads. Then they brought out a red royal wrapper, woven with threads of silver and blue. As they tied it around her, Rachel looked at her reflection in a bronze mirror. She didn't recognize herself. The poor orphan was gone. In her place stood a queen, graceful, regal, and beautiful. The drums began to beat louder outside. It was time for her to step into the royal court. And this time, she wouldn't be walking with shame. She would walk with pride. The palace drums thundered across the village as Rachel stepped into the royal courtyard, dressed in the red and silver wrapper. Her neck heavy with coral beads, and her hair adorned like a true queen. A golden veil flowed behind her as she walked, escorted by royal maidens on both sides. Her feet, once dusty from village roads, now touched polished marble. The crowd that once mocked her was now silent, watching in awe. The king rose from his seat, smiling as his eyes followed her every step. The queen leaned forward towards her husband and whispered, "That is not just a beautiful girl. She carries dignity, like someone born in the palace." Rachel smiled. Rachel reached the center of the court and knelt gracefully before them. She greeted with trembling lips. The queen walked down from her throne and lifted Rachel up with both hands. "My daughter," she said, placing a hand on Rachel's shoulder, "you are welcome. From this moment forward, you are no longer a stranger to this palace. You are now part of us." Prince Lucas stepped forward and took Rachel's hand. "With the blessing of my father the king and my mother the queen, I present to you my bride." The crowd erupted in cheers. Flutes played, drums pounded, maidens danced. It was a celebration unlike anything the village had ever seen. Even Madame Stella, who had crept in quietly through the side gates, hid behind a pillar, weeping with regret. She stared at the girl she had once treated like trash, now being crowned with honor before the entire kingdom. And as the sun set that evening, Rachel stood beside her prince, her heart finally at peace. She had walked through pain and shame, and now she was home.